Picture this. The gym's half empty after the final buzzer, lights buzzing overhead, and Lena's standing there with her plastic crate of bottled water, the cheap kind from the corner store. Marcus looks her up and down, sweat still on his jersey, and says loud enough for the stragglers to hear, "$5? For that? Keep it. Nobody's paying your kind of price for tap water in a bottle." Now you have to understand something right away. Marcus had no idea the woman he'd just brushed off like lint was the only reason his family's factory was still running without the layoffs everyone expected. And here's the part nobody on that court knew yet. That same night he was about to wager with his buddy Derek that he could get her to go out with him inside 3 days, or else spend the rest of the season answering to Dad. So what happens when a bet like that meets a girl who spent her whole life carrying more than she lets on? Lena was 22. Working 3 jobs on top of her finance classes, mostly to keep the bill collectors from circling her father's door after her mother passed. The debts were from his old gambling habit, the kind that didn't stop just because the funeral flowers wilted. Marcus, meanwhile, was the senior everyone knew by first name, the one whose family owned the plant out on River Road and who walked through campus like the sidewalks had been poured just for him. That night at the game, she kept her head down and kept offering bottles anyway, even after his words landed. A couple of underclassmen bought one each out of pity, the change clinking in her pocket like loose screws. She counted it twice under the bleachers, making sure the math lined up for the electric bill due Friday. By the time the last players cleared out, Marcus had circled back. He pulled out his wallet in front of the few folks still hanging around and bought every bottle she had left, 23 of them, at full price, drawing a couple of cheers and a whistle from the maintenance guy stacking chairs. The crate emptied fast. Lena thanked him the way she thanked every customer, quiet and steady. But once the others drifted off, Marcus leaned in close enough for only her and Derek to catch it. "Don't get used to the charity," he said, the smile never reaching his eyes. "Just felt like clearing your junk before the janitor complained about the mess." Derek laughed like it was the cleverest line he'd heard all week. Lena didn't answer. She just folded the bills once, slipped them into her coat, and walked toward the side door with the empty crate tapping against her leg. What Marcus couldn't see was the way she already knew how to read a man who thought money bought the last word. She had been reading them since she was 16. After all, every time her father came home short on rent. And the way she moved through that empty gym, counting each step like it was already owed to somebody else, told you the bet he was about to make was about to land on ground a whole lot harder than he figured. Day 1 started the next morning when Marcus showed up outside her 8 o'clock lecture with coffee and that same easy grin. Day 1 kept rolling from there, and you could already feel the ground shifting under Marcus's feet even if he didn't know it yet. He stood outside the lecture hall with 2 paper cups, one in each hand, and that grin that said he expected her to thank him for breathing the same air. "Figured you could use this after last night," he said, loud enough for the other students filing past to hear. Lena took the cup without a word, nodded once, and kept walking toward the side exit where the morning light hit the sidewalk in long stripes. Marcus fell in beside her like they were old friends catching up. "Listen, my old man mentioned your name last week," he went on. "Something about a quiet investor keeping the lights on at the plant. Thought maybe you knew the guy." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a folded paper napkin from her coat pocket, the same one she'd carried since the night her father died, the one with the single line of his handwriting still visible if you held it to the light, and wiped a ring of condensation from the cup. The napkin smelled faintly of the plant's old break room, the one with the cracked linoleum and the coffee that always tasted like it had been sitting since the early shift. Marcus didn't notice. He was too busy talking about how his family needed fresh eyes on the books, how the next quarterly report was due in 43 days, and how a sharp student like her might earn a real recommendation if she played things right. What Marcus couldn't see was the way Lena already knew every line item in those books. She'd been the one wiring the quiet transfers for 3 years now, ever since the night she overheard the union rep say the plant would close if another quarter went red. Her father's old pension had covered the first gap. Then came the small inheritance from an aunt nobody talked about. After that, every extra hour she worked at the community college tutoring center went straight into an account Marcus's father never questioned because the checks arrived under a name that meant nothing to him. L.M. Calder, the same initials her mother had used on the mortgage papers back when the house still felt like home. By mid-morning, the coffee had gone cold in her hand. Marcus checked his watch, said he had a meeting with the dean, and told her to think about the offer. "Don't make me chase you," he added, the grin tightening just a fraction. Lena watched him walk away, then turned down the narrow path behind the maintenance building where the old loading dock still smelled of diesel and wet cardboard. There, behind a stack of pallets, sat the real reason she'd come this way. A stack of invoices from the plant's supplier, the ones she'd quietly paid last month so the delivery trucks wouldn't stop rolling. She tucked the napkin back into her pocket, smoothed the top invoice flat, and made a single note in the margin with a pencil stub she kept in her sleeve. Day 2 brought the first real snag. Marcus showed up at her part-time shift in the campus bookstore, this time with Derek in tow and a printed copy of the plant's overdue utility notice. "Thought you might want to see what real problems look like," he said, sliding the paper across the counter while 2 freshmen waited behind him for change. The notice was dated 3 days out. Lena recognized the account number immediately. It was the same one she'd covered twice already under a different routing code. She rang up the books without comment, handed back the receipt, and waited until the boys left before stepping into the stockroom. There, under the single bulb that always hummed, she made the call she'd been avoiding. A 3-minute conversation with the plant's accountant that ended with another quiet transfer, this one routed through the same old pension account. The napkin came out again when she hung up, this time to blot a drop of ink from her thumb. She folded it once more, tucked it away, and stepped back out to finish her shift. By the end of that day, the plant's books still showed red on paper, but the light stayed on. Marcus, of course, never heard a word about it. He was already planning how he'd take credit for the fix once the numbers turned. And Lena? She just kept walking the same path behind the bookstore, counting her steps the way she always had, the napkin pressing against her coat like a promise she hadn't yet decided whether to keep. Day 3 started quiet enough, the way these things often do. Lena clocked into the bookstore just after 8, same as always, and you could see the wear on her from the night before, the slight stoop in her shoulders, the way her fingers moved slower when she sorted the returns bin. Marcus had left that utility notice on the counter like a trophy, but the lights at the plant stayed on because of what she'd done in the stockroom. She didn't tell a soul. Instead, she kept her head down, ringing sales and restocking the travel section where the old guidebooks gathered dust. Then the call came through on the store phone around noon. It was the plant foreman, a man named Hal who'd known Lena since she ran the night shift books 20 years back. His voice sounded thin over the line. "We've got a shipment of gaskets sitting at the rail yard with no driver to bring them in," he said. Marcus told the supplier we were closing the account. Said it was his decision as the one taking over. Lena listened without interrupting, the receiver pressed to her ear while 2 customers browsed the mystery rack. She told how she'd handle it, hung up, and stepped into the stockroom again. Under that same humming bulb, she dialed the rail dispatcher from memory, used the same pension routing that had covered the utilities, and arranged for the gaskets to move by 4 that afternoon. The napkin came out of her pocket while she waited on hold. She unfolded it, traced the faint pencil mark from the invoices the day before, then folded it smaller and slipped it away before the call ended. By the time her shift finished, the shipment was rolling. Marcus never knew. He spent the afternoon in the plant office telling Derek how he'd saved the utility bill by threatening to walk away. Lena walked home the long way, past the maintenance building, and you could almost hear her counting the steps again. Steady, deliberate, the way a person does when they've measured the same ground for decades. Day 4 brought the next snag, smaller on the surface but sharper underneath. A parts inspector from the main supplier showed up at the plant gate with a clipboard and a question about the last 3 payments. The routing codes didn't match the account on file, and the man was asking to speak to whoever had authorized the transfers. Marcus met him at the door, all bluster, claiming he'd handled it himself and that any confusion came from old records that needed cleaning out. The inspector left after 20 minutes, but the visit left a trail. Lena heard about it from Hal later that evening, a quick call while she sat on her back porch with a cup of tea cooling beside her. She made another note on the napkin that night, this time in the margin beside the earlier one, then tucked it into the coat she hung by the door. 19 hours to the next supplier deadline, the one that would decide whether the line kept running or stalled for lack of steel stock. Lena spent the evening at the kitchen table, the napkin spread flat under the lamp, adding one careful line at a time. She didn't sleep much. When morning came, she was back at the bookstore, and the mini-crisis arrived right on schedule. Marcus and Derek returned, this time with a copy of the plant's insurance renewal notice. "This one's on you if it lapses," Marcus said, loud enough for the whole counter line to hear. "Old hands like you never kept proper files anyway." Lena rang the sale, handed over the change, and waited until they left before she stepped into the stockroom once more. The call this time went to the insurance office, another quiet transfer through the pension account, and the napkin blotted another drop of ink from her thumb when she hung up. The renewal cleared by close of business. Marcus took credit in the group text he sent to the remaining crew. Lena counted her steps home again, the napkin pressed flat against her side, the pencil stub ready in her sleeve for whatever the next day would ask of her. The next morning brought the supplier deadline down to 8 hours, and Lena felt it in the way the old coat hung heavier on the hook by her kitchen door. She'd marked the time on the napkin before sunrise, right under the line about the insurance transfer, and now the pencil stub waited again while she walked the same route to the bookstore. You ever notice how one problem never travels alone? That supplier inspector wasn't finished. By 10 o'clock, the plant's receiving dock called in a fresh complaint. The steel stock order had been flagged for a credit hold, and the warehouse needed a verified payment or the whole shipment sat on the truck until the next billing cycle. Marcus stood in the doorway again, the same clipboard in his hand, and told the crew the delay was nothing more than bookkeeping from the old guard that nobody bothered to fix. He didn't mention Lena's name this time, but the look he shot toward the counter said enough. Derek just nodded along, already repeating the line to the two younger hands still left on the floor. Lena rang up a customer's paperback without looking up, the napkin folded twice in her pocket. She waited until the shop emptied at lunch, then stepped into the stockroom the way she had the day before. The call went out to the pension office again. Another quiet authorization routed through the account no one at the plant had touched in years. This time, the amount showed on the confirmation slip as exactly the shortfall the warehouse needed. She blotted the edge of the napkin with her thumb when she hung up, adding the new figure in the margin beside the insurance note. By 2 o'clock, the truck rolled through the gate. Marcus sent the same group text, this one reading "Crisis handled. Line stays on schedule." No mention of where the funds had come from, only that the old records had finally been cleaned up. Lena heard about it from Hal on the evening call, his voice low on the back porch while the tea cooled untouched beside her. She made one more careful mark on the napkin, then slipped it back into the coat pocket. 4 days out from the auction now. The next morning the plant faced a smaller but sharper problem. The union rep showed up wanting signatures on the safety audit forms that had sat unsigned since the last inspector's visit. Marcus brushed it off at the gate, telling the man the paperwork was already in order and that any gaps came from people who didn't know when to step aside. The rep left with the forms still blank. Lena caught the detail from the same evening call with Hal. She added the date and the missing signature line to the napkin under the lamplight, then placed another transfer through the pension account to cover the expedited audit fee the plant had let slide. The forms came back approved by close of business. Marcus claimed the credit in the next text, and the crew answered with the same tired thanks. Lena counted the steps home once more, the napkin now carrying 6 neat lines of ink. She pressed it flat against her side as she hung the coat, the pencil stub still tucked in her sleeve. The auction clock kept ticking, and the next call would come when it always did, right on schedule. 3 days out from the auction now, and the next morning brought a fresh pinch that nobody at the plant saw coming. The parts supplier called at 7 sharp, refusing to release the next shipment until the past due invoice cleared. Marcus met the driver at the loading dock and waved him off with the same line he'd used on the Union Man. "We'll settle accounts after the auction clears the books." The driver backed the truck out without unloading a single crate. Lena heard the story secondhand again, this time from Hal's evening porch call while the kettle whistled low on the stove. She set the receiver down long enough to pull the napkin from her coat pocket, smoothed the creases under the kitchen light, and added the invoice number in her careful script. Then she stepped to the sideboard, lifted the phone once more, and authorized another quiet draw from the pension account. Exactly the amount needed, no extra. No signature trail that would point back to her. By noon, the supplier rang the plant again, surprised to report the balance paid in full and the crates already rolling. Marcus took the credit in the next group text, calling it old paperwork finally catching up. The crew answered with thumbs-up emojis and the same weary relief they'd sent the day before. Lena marked the line, folded the napkin smaller, and slipped it back into the pocket where the pencil stub waited. That evening the temperature dropped, and the old coat felt heavier on her shoulders as she walked the last block home. She pressed her thumb once against the napkin through the wool, feeling the raised ink from every quiet fix she'd recorded. Hal's voice on the final call of the night carried a new note, tired, but steadier than it had sounded in weeks. He mentioned the supplier story without naming the source, and Lena let the silence stretch before she answered. "Some things just need the right hand on the wheel," she said, and left it there. 2 days out, the auction papers arrived at the front office in a thick manila envelope. Marcus spread them across the break room table during the midday break and told anyone within earshot that the place would fetch more broken than running. Lena learned about the envelope from the same evening call, the napkin already waiting on the kitchen table beside her. She added the date and the words auction docs beneath the last line, then placed one more transfer, this one covering the final lien on the main press so the title would read clean on the block. The lien release showed up in Marcus's inbox before supper. He forwarded it to the crew as proof the sale could move forward without delay. Lena counted the fresh mark with the others, 6 becoming 7, and slid the napkin into the coat again. The pencil stub pressed against her wrist as she reached for the light switch. Outside, the wind rattled the porch screen the way it had every autumn she could remember, and the next call would come right on schedule, just like all the ones before. With 2 days left, that next call came right on schedule, just like Lena knew it would. Hal sounded steadier on the line, but the words still carried weight. "Marcus is telling everyone the auction's just a formality now," he said. "Says the lien release proves the books are clean." Lena didn't answer right away. She pressed her thumb against the napkin again, feeling the 7 marks already there, and added an 8th line for the call itself. "Some hands just know where the wheel needs turning," she said at last, and let the quiet settle between them. The following morning brought the first real hitch of the day. A buyer's agent phoned the front office at 10 sharp, wanting proof the main press could pass inspection before the block opened. Marcus's voice carried through the break room wall, sharp and defensive, insisting the paperwork was already in order. The crew stood around the table listening, coffee going cold in their mugs. Lena heard about it the same way she heard most things now, through Hal's evening call, the napkin waiting on the kitchen table. She made one more quiet transfer that afternoon, this one to cover the inspection fee the agent had flagged, then marked the napkin a 9th time. The pencil stub felt smaller between her fingers. Marcus took the credit again, of course. He forwarded the confirmation email to the crew and added a note that the agent had seen reason. The thumbs-up emojis came back slower this time. Lena folded the napkin smaller still and slipped it into the coat pocket with the pencil. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of the river 2 blocks over, the same smell that had clung to her sleeves the day she first walked those plant floors 40 years ago. One day out, the mini-crisis arrived right after lunch. The auction house called to say one of the title searches had turned up an old Union lien nobody had listed on the envelope. Marcus went white in the face at his desk. He told the crew it was nothing, just another piece of old paperwork, but his hands shook when he hung up. Lena learned the details from Hal again, the napkin already spread open under the kitchen light. She made the final transfer that evening, enough to clear the lien by morning, and added the 10th mark. The raised ink felt steady under her thumb. Hal's voice on that last call carried something new, a note of real worry. "If this falls through, the boys lose the last month's pay," he said. Lena let the silence stretch. "Some things just need the right hand on the wheel," she answered, same as before. She could almost hear him nodding on the other end. That night the coat felt heavier when she stepped out for the short walk to clear her head. She kept one hand in the pocket, feeling the napkin and the pencil stub together. The wind rattled the porch screen behind her the way it always had, but the sound didn't bother her. She'd heard it through every season the plant had stood, through every quiet choice she'd made to keep the doors open without ever saying why. 19 hours to the auction. The title cleared and the inspection passed without another word from the agent. Marcus sent another group text, this one claiming the whole thing had been handled at the source. The emojis came back faster now, but Lena marked the napkin anyway, an 11th line before she turned out the light. The raised ink had started to blur a little from the handling, yet the shape of each mark still held. She pressed her thumb to the last one and let the quiet of the house settle around her, the way it always did before the next call. 18 hours to the auction, and the next call came just after the sun was up. Hal's voice sounded thinner this time, like he'd been up all night too. "Marcus pulled the crew in early," he said. "Told them if any more liens show, the sale's off and the last checks bounce." One of the younger hands started packing his tools right there on the floor. Lena stood at the counter with the napkin already smoothed flat. She added the 12th line while Hal kept talking, the pencil stub making its familiar scratch. The mark sat neat beside the others, 11 quiet records of what she'd moved without ever putting her name on a single form. She waited until Hal finished, then asked the one question she always saved for these mornings. What would it take to keep that boy from walking? Hal didn't answer right away. She could hear the plant radio in the background, the same station that had played through every shift she'd worked. Finally he said the number low like he hated having to name it. Lena made the call to the payroll office before the coffee finished brewing. The transfer went through under the same quiet account she'd used for 40 years, the one nobody at the plant had ever traced back to the woman who used to run the third shift books. By 9 o'clock the young hand's check had cleared and his toolbox stayed put. Marcus never knew where the money came from. He just sent another text that afternoon, this one shorter, handled. Lena marked the napkin a 13th time while the radio played the noon farm report. The raised ink was softening now, the lines starting to overlap where her thumb had pressed too often, but each one still held its shape. She wondered, not for the first time, what the plant floor would smell like once the auction gavel fell. Machine oil and old wood, the same as it had the day she first walked those floors. 17 hours left, and the mini-crisis showed up in the form of a last-minute title objection from the county clerk. Something about an old easement nobody had recorded right. Marcus called Hal directly this time, his voice loud enough that Lena could hear it through the phone even from across the kitchen. "If we miss this window, we miss the whole sale," he said. "Those men don't get another chance." Hal promised he'd look into it, then hung up and dialed Lena without even waiting for the plant to clear out. She listened, then made the single call that cleared the easement by 3 o'clock. The clerk on the other end recognized her voice from years back, asked after her late husband's pension, and never once asked why the money came from the same account that had covered every shortfall since the first lien. Lena folded the napkin once more and slipped it into the coat pocket with the pencil stub. The fabric was starting to wear where the raised lines pressed against it, but the coat still fit the way it always had. She stepped out onto the porch while the light was still good, the wind moving the screen door the same slow way it had moved it the night she'd decided to keep the plant running without telling a soul. 17 hours. The auction house would open its doors at 10 tomorrow, and every line on that napkin stood between the crew and an empty envelope. 16 hours. The day settled into the long quiet stretch between supper and dark, the kind of stretch that used to mean overtime sheets and coffee left in the pot. Lena sat with the coat across her lap, thumb moving from mark to mark the way she'd once moved from station to station on the floor. Each line answered a different call, a different year. The roof that leaked in '89, the insurance gap in '02, the payroll that almost missed Christmas in '14. She never added the years to the napkin. The marks were enough. And here's the part Marcus still didn't know when he called the crew together one last time at closing bell. The easement had been cleared by the same hand that had kept the doors open through every one of those years. The men went home with their tools still in the lockers, and the auction papers stayed clean. Lena pressed the 13th mark once more before she turned out the kitchen light. The napkin felt thinner now, but the shape held. 16 hours. The next call would come when it came. 16 hours stretched into 15 the way a night shift used to stretch when the line was down and every minute cost someone's light bill. Lena woke before the alarm, same as always, and the napkin was still in the coat pocket where she'd left it. The fabric smelled faintly of the oil from the floor, the same smell that had lived in her husband's coveralls for 37 years. She traced the newest mark once, the one that had cleared the easement, then folded the napkin smaller so it wouldn't catch on the zipper. Marcus had the crew back at 7 sharp, even though there was nothing left to clock into. He stood by the time clock with his arms crossed, telling them the auction would settle what the liens hadn't. "We take what we're offered and we walk," he said. One of the younger men, the one who'd started last spring and still called everybody by their last names, asked about the easement notice that had disappeared overnight. Marcus told him not to worry about paperwork that wasn't his to read. Lena heard it through the half-open window while she washed the single coffee cup. She didn't step out. Instead, she made the quiet call she'd been saving for exactly this kind of snag. The one to the man who still held the old union records and knew which inspector owed which favor from the days when her husband had walked the picket line with him. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. By 8:30, the inspector's truck was already turning into the lot, and the citation that would have shut the doors before the auction even opened was quietly withdrawn. Marcus never saw the paper. The crew just noticed the truck leave again and went back to stacking crates like nothing had changed. 14 hours. Lena sat on the porch step with the coat across her knees again, pencil stub in hand. She added one more short line, not because she needed the reminder but because the napkin had become the only place the years still made sense. Each mark carried its own sound. The creak of the old press when it finally got new bearings in '97. The hush that fell over the break room the Christmas the bonuses arrived in plain envelopes no one could trace. She never wrote names. Names would have made it about her, and that wasn't the point. Inside the plant, Marcus was on the phone again, this time to the auction house, asking whether the equipment could be moved before the final bids. The clerk on the other end said the title search still showed one small encumbrance from the county. Marcus swore under his breath and hung up. He didn't know the encumbrance had been paid 3 days earlier from an account that had never carried his name. Lena pressed the newest mark flat with her thumb until the paper lay smooth again. 13 hours. The light was starting to slant across the floor the way it always did at mid-morning, catching the dust that rose every time the big door rolled open. One of the older hands, the man who'd trained under her husband, walked past the office window and stopped. He looked at the coat still hanging on the peg where Lena had left it the day the first layoff notice went up. The coat had a small tear near the cuff now, the same tear she'd meant to mend for years. The man reached out, touched the edge of the sleeve, then let his hand drop. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once to the empty office and kept walking. Lena watched from the porch. She didn't wave. She simply stood slipped the napkin back into the pocket, and turned toward the street where the auction house sign was already visible 2 blocks down. 12 hours. The next call would come when it came, and the napkin still held every line that mattered. Lena stayed on that porch a while longer, watching the light move across the empty street. 11 hours now, and the napkin in her pocket felt heavier with each new mark she'd pressed into it. She pulled it out again, the pencil stub already worn flat on one side, and added a single short stroke beside the others. Not for the money this time, for the way old Walt had touched the coat sleeve and walked on without a word. That counted. Inside the plant, Marcus stood at the big workbench, staring at a stack of invoices that wouldn't balance no matter how many times he ran the numbers. He'd told the crew the auction would clear everything. Equipment gone by Friday, building locked by Monday. One of the younger men asked about the back wages still owed. Marcus didn't answer. He just folded the top sheet and shoved it into his pocket like it might disappear on its own. What Marcus didn't see was the envelope that arrived at the county clerk's office that same morning. Payment in full for the 3 months of utilities the plant had run on credit. The clerk stamped it, filed it, and never thought to mention the name on the check because there wasn't one. Lena had walked the envelope down herself 2 days earlier, early enough that the streetlights were still on. She left it in the night drop box and kept walking, the way she always did. 10 hours. The light had climbed high enough to reach the far corner of the office window where her husband's coat still hung. Another older hand stopped this time, a man named Ray who'd run the second press for 28 years. He stood there longer than Walt had. His fingers hovered near the tear in the cuff, then dropped. He shook his head once, the way a man does when he's trying to remember something he can't quite reach. Lena saw it from the bench across the street. She didn't move. She just smoothed the napkin flat against her knee and waited. The next call came at 9:47. Marcus took it in the office with the door half open. The auction house wanted confirmation the county lien was cleared. Marcus said it wasn't voice tight. The voice on the other end said the records showed otherwise, wired from an account the plant had never used. Marcus hung up, stared at the phone, then at the coat on the peg. He reached for the sleeve the way the others had, stopped short, and let his hand fall. For the first time he looked unsure. Not sorry yet, just unsure. Lena added another mark while she listened through the open window. This one for the lien. She'd paid it the same week the first layoff notice went up, because she remembered how her husband used to say a man's word was only as good as the roof over the machines. The napkin was getting crowded now, but the lines still made sense to her. They always had. Ray came out the side door a few minutes later, lunch pail in hand, and paused when he saw her sitting there. He didn't speak, just gave the same small nod Walt had given the empty office. Lena nodded back once. That was all. He kept walking toward the corner. 9 hours left, and the street felt quieter than it should have for midday. Marcus made another call after that, this one to the bank. He wanted to know why the lien showed paid when he hadn't touched the account. The teller said the funds came from a trust the plant had never listed. Marcus asked for the trust name. The teller said it didn't carry one. Just a number and a standing instruction that dated back 7 years. Marcus set the phone down without hanging it up. The dial tone filled the office until someone in the plant pulled the door shut from the outside. Lena folded the napkin one more time and slipped it away. She could feel the next mark already forming in her mind, the one that would come when the riggers showed up to move the presses. She wouldn't stop them. She'd already arranged for the new bearings to be waiting at the loading dock, paid for 6 weeks ago. Marcus would see the crates and assume the auction house had sent them. That was fine. The point was never the credit. It was keeping the old press running long enough for the men who still knew its sound to find work before the doors closed for good. 8 hours. The light had started to slide toward the west wall. Lena stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and crossed the street again. She didn't go inside. She simply stood at the window where the coat hung and looked at the tear near the cuff. Still there. Still waiting. She touched the pocket where the napkin rested and turned back toward the bench. The auction sign 2 blocks down swayed once in a small wind. The next call would come when it came. 7 hours left when the first rigger truck backed up to the loading dock. The driver killed the engine and stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. Same way Ray used to do after a shift. Lena stayed on the bench across the street and watched the cab door swing open. Marcus came out to meet them, already shaking his head before the paperwork was even unclipped. He pointed at the invoice and said the crates weren't on his list, that nothing moved until he signed for it himself. The driver shrugged and handed over the clipboard anyway. Paid in full 6 weeks ago, he said. Standing order from the trust account. Marcus stared at the signature line a long time. No name, just the same account number the bank had given him earlier. He asked if the driver knew who set it up. The driver said he only knew the crates were marked for the old presses and that someone had called ahead to make sure the bearings matched the serials on the machines. Marcus folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket without another word. He told the riggers to hold where they were. Lena touched the napkin through her skirt. She had written the bearing numbers on it 3 weeks earlier, right after the last time the number 3 press threw a fit and Ray had to shut it down mid-run. The ink had smudged a little from being folded so many times, but the numbers were still clear enough. She wondered if Marcus would recognize the handwriting if he ever unfolded it himself. Probably not. He had only ever seen her write out time cards. 6 hours and the light had gone copper on the brick wall. A second truck pulled in behind the first, this one carrying the smaller crates for the feed rollers. The driver honked once, short and polite. Marcus came back out, this time with the plant's old maintenance log under his arm. He flipped pages while the riggers waited, cross-checking dates against the delivery slips. Every entry he looked for was already marked "handled" in the same neat block letters that used to fill out the daily production sheets. He closed the log without slamming it. That was new. Inside, someone had started moving the coat from the hook by the window. Lena saw the sleeve lift, then pause. A younger hand reached into the pocket and came out empty. The coat went back up. She stayed on the bench. The napkin was still safe against her side. 5 hours and the auction sign 2 blocks down caught a gust and spun once on its chain. Marcus made one more call from the office, this time to the auction house itself. He wanted to know if they had authorized any parts shipments. They hadn't. He asked if they knew anything about a numbered trust paying old liens. They didn't. When he hung up, the dial tone lasted longer than usual before the line clicked dead on its own. Lena stood, stretched the stiffness from her knees, and walked the half-block to the corner store for a cup of coffee she didn't need. The woman behind the counter asked if she was waiting on someone. Lena said she was just killing time before a bus. She paid with exact change, folded the receipt once, and slipped it into the same pocket as the napkin. Outside again, the light had dropped enough that the street lamps were starting to buzz. For hours and the first bearing crate was open on the dock. Ray stood at the edge of it, running a finger along the edge of the new part like he was listening for something only the metal could tell him. He looked across the street, caught Lena's eye for half a second, and gave the same small nod as before. She nodded back. Neither of them smiled. The rigger asked if they should start loading the old presses onto the flatbed. Ray said not yet. He wanted to see if the new bearings seated right first. Marcus didn't argue. He just watched the men lift the crate and carry it inside, the way someone watches a tide come in when they've already decided they can't stop it. 3 hours left and the plant's side door stayed propped open on a wedge of wood. The sound of the number 3 press turning over drifted out, steady for the first time in months. Lena stayed on the bench until the last of the daylight left the bricks. She folded the napkin one more time, feeling the creases line up exactly the way they always had. The next mark was already forming in her mind, the one that would come when the men started talking about where the work would go after the doors closed. She wouldn't tell them. She'd already made the calls to the 3 shops 2 towns over that still ran the same machines. Marcus would find the referrals on his desk in the morning and assume the union had sent them. That was fine. The point was never the credit. It was keeping the old hands moving long enough to land somewhere that still knew their names. 2 hours and the street felt even quieter than before. Lena stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and crossed back to the window where the coat still hung. The tear near the cuff had not moved. She touched the pocket once more and turned toward the corner. The auction sign swayed again, slower this time, as if the wind itself had decided to wait. You have to picture the next morning on what they were already calling day 3. The auction was now just 41 hours away, and the side door was still propped open. But the number 3 press had started coughing again right after the second shift left. Ray was already inside with his sleeves rolled past the elbows, listening to the metal the way a man listens to an old friend who's trying not to complain. Lena sat on the same bench across the street, the napkin folded 4 times in her lap, the creases matching the ones her mother used to press into the cloth before Sunday supper. She watched the rigger step out and light a cigarette, heard him mutter something about the new bearings running hot already. Marcus came out a minute later, jaw set, and told the man to shut it down before they ruined the last good set they had. He didn't raise his voice. He just sounded tired, the way a man sounds when he's already practiced the speech he'll give at the auction. Lena waited until the street emptied again. Then she crossed, slipped through the side door, and left the napkin on the bench exactly where the rigger usually sat for his break. Inside, the smell of warm oil and old rubber hung heavy. Ray looked up from the press, saw her, and gave that same small nod. She nodded back. Neither spoke. She walked over to the control panel, lifted the cover no one else ever touched, and tightened the 2 bolts that had worked loose during the night. The press settled into its rhythm again, steady enough that Marcus, standing in the doorway, didn't notice the change until he'd already walked halfway back to his office. He stopped, listened, and said nothing. By noon, the calls Lena had placed the evening before started landing. The first shop 2 towns over called Marcus directly, asking if any of his hands wanted steady work on machines they still ran. He listened, thanked them, and hung up without asking who had given them the number. He assumed the union. That was the safe assumption. The second call came while he was still holding the receiver. Same question, same quiet thanks. Marcus walked to the window and looked out at the bench. The napkin was gone. He didn't mention it to anyone. The new mini-crisis came at 3 in the afternoon when the rigger reported that the flatbed driver had backed into the loading dock and cracked the main hydraulic line on the number 2 press. Marcus stood in the yard with his hands on his hips, staring at the fluid spreading across the concrete. 40 hours to the auction and now another bill they couldn't pay. He told the men to cover it with a tarp and keep loading what they could. Ray stayed by the number 3 press, running his hand along the housing like he was taking its temperature. Lena, back on the bench, unfolded the napkin once, refolded it on the new mark she'd been carrying in her head, and waited for the street to clear again. She made the 3rd call from the payphone on the corner at 4. The shop owner on the other end asked no questions, just said he'd send a replacement line by morning and bill it to an account already open in the plant's name. Lena hung up, crossed the street, and left the napkin on the rigger's bench once more. When the rigger found it at quitting time, he carried it inside without comment and set it on the corner of Marcus's desk. Marcus picked it up, turned it over, and traced the creases with his thumb. He didn't ask where it had come from. He just slipped it into his jacket pocket and told the crew they could go home early. The plant stayed open one more night because the number 3 press kept running, and nobody said a word about who had made sure it would. 36 hours to the auction and the phone on Marcus's desk rang again before the crew even punched in. This time it was the county inspector, wanting to know why the environmental report on the hydraulic fluid spill had come across his desk already stamped paid and closed. Marcus told him there must be some mistake. He hadn't filed anything. The inspector said the fee had been covered by an account the plant had never listed before. Marcus thanked him, hung up, and stood there with the receiver still warm in his hand. He didn't ask who had opened that account. The new trouble showed up at the loading dock just after lunch. A man in a county jacket walked the length of the yard with a clipboard, counting the presses that were supposed to be tagged for scrap. He stopped at the number 3 press, the one still running, and said the serial number didn't match the auction manifest. Said the whole lot would have to be re-inspected before any sale could go forward, and re-inspections cost time the auction couldn't spare. $42,000 in penalties if they missed the deadline. The man left his card on the bench and drove away. Marcus looked at the card, then at the press, then at the men waiting for orders. Ray muttered that it didn't matter anyway, the machines were already spoken for. Lena sat on the bench with the napkin folded in her lap, tracing the old crease with one finger. She waited until the yard cleared, then walked to the pay phone on the corner. She made one call. The woman who answered didn't need the plant name. She just asked for the inspector's badge number and said she'd handle the manifest correction by end of day. Lena thanked her, hung up, and left the napkin on the rigger's bench again. At quitting time, the rigger found it, carried it inside, and set it on Marcus's desk without a word. Marcus turned the napkin over, saw the new crease Lena had pressed in, and slipped it into his pocket the same way he had the night before. He told the crew they could knock off early again. The plant stayed open one more night because the number 3 press kept running and because the inspector's card never got used. 30 hours to the auction and the first potential buyer arrived early, walking the floor with a flashlight and a list of what he intended to strip for parts. He stopped at the number 2 press, the one with the cracked line still under the tarp, and said the whole machine was junk. Said he'd pay scrap weight only. Marcus didn't argue. He just walked the buyer to the gate and locked it behind him. Lena watched from across the street. She made her call at dusk, this time to a man who used to run the parts division at the old company. He listened, asked no questions about why the plant still needed the line, and promised a delivery truck by morning. Lena left the napkin on the rigger's bench one more time before the streetlights came on. The rigger found it, carried it in, and set it on the corner of Marcus's desk. Marcus picked it up, felt the fresh crease, and didn't ask who kept leaving it. He just told the men the number 2 press would be ready after all, and they believed him because they had no reason left to doubt the quiet way things kept working out. Marcus stood there in the half-light of the shop, napkin still warm from his pocket, and you could feel the whole place holding its breath. The buyer came back the next morning with 2 more men in suits, flashlights sweeping the presses like they were already counting scrap. He pointed at the number 2 line and said, "That one's dead weight. I'll take the building for parts and nothing else." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He just asked if the man wanted to see it run first. The buyer laughed once, short, and walked out. Auction day came in on a Tuesday. The old hall on River Street still smelled like wet cardboard and floor wax the way it had when Marcus was a boy bringing his father lunch. Lena arrived early, gray coat buttoned to the collar, and took a seat on the side aisle where nobody looked twice. The same buyer from the plant sat 3 rows ahead with his clipboard. When the gavel opened on the number 2 press, he stood and offered scrap weight again, loud enough for the room to hear. "Junk," he repeated. "Pay by the ton and be done with it." Marcus stayed by the door, hands in his jacket. Then the bids started coming in from the back, quiet at first, then steadier. One man from the old parts division raised his hand. Another from the supplier Lena had called at dusk added 5,000. The rigger who had carried the napkin each night stood up and named a figure that covered the mortgage outright. The room turned. The buyer with the clipboard lowered it, face gone slack. By the time the gavel fell, the press had sold for 3 times scrap, and every other machine followed because the line was already running and the manifest was clean. Lena waited until the hall emptied. She found Marcus at the pay phone on the corner, the same one she had used. He turned when he heard her step. She held out the napkin, the last crease still sharp. "You never asked who kept leaving these," she said. Marcus looked at the cloth, then at her. "I figured the plant would tell me when it was ready," he answered. He folded the napkin once more and gave it back. Your husband would have done the same. The apology came first in the truck on the way back. Marcus staring at the road, voice low, saying he had stopped listening the day the first inspector showed up. The public one came 3 weeks later at the Union Hall, in front of the same men who had watched the buyer laugh. Marcus stood at the front table and told them the quiet hands that had kept the number 3 press alive belonged to the woman most of them had walked past every morning. He asked Lena to stand. She did, napkin in her lap again, and the room rose without anyone telling it to. After the papers were signed, Lena took the napkin home and placed it in the top drawer beside her husband's union card. The plant stayed open under a new crew that still calls her on the 1st of every month. Marcus stops by on Fridays with coffee, and they sit on the front steps without needing many words. The rigger still finds the occasional creased napkin on his bench, though nobody leaves them anymore. They just appear when a line needs one more night. What stays with you is how little any of it asked for in return. A lifetime of showing up without a signature, of fixing what broke before anyone noticed it was gone. That was the only power Lena ever kept. The plant runs because she let it. And the men who once measured everything by what they could strip for parts now measure their days by the sound of the presses still turning at dusk.